Hi everyone, welcome back. So today we're taking a look at The Flea by Donne. If you've read this whole poem already, and I hope you do that before you listen to the rest of this video, you know that it's pretty provocative. It's actually probably the most famous example of a pickup line in English literature, and it is the most famous example of what's called a metaphysical conceit. That's one of the terms on your poetry handout, on the poetry terms list that you need to know for the quiz. So it's one that you might want to jot down here in your notes. A metaphysical conceit is some sort of metaphor, a comparison of two things that's unexpected or provocative or kind of strange or clever that's sustained throughout the entire poem. So in The Flea, John Donne is using this gross image of a flea, this vampiric little pest that sucks blood, and he's connecting that to something much bigger. He's attempting to use the flea as a metaphor for something else, and he's doing that throughout his entire poem. This is, like I said, the most famous example of a metaphysical conceit. Most likely The Flea was written in about 1590. We don't know exactly when it was written, but it was published well after that. But most likely it was written when John Donne was studying to be a lawyer when he was a young man. So one theory is that he was actually trying to impress his lawyer friends by how witty he could be in this poem. Although many of you will read this poem and find it not only provocative, but maybe incredibly offensive or incredibly irritating or annoying. Other people might find it witty. You could also say that this poem is an example of a pickup line, those ridiculous pickup lines that you see in movies, but a pickup line from the Renaissance. Obviously, it doesn't appear to work out too well for the speaker of this poem, but by the time you get to the end of the poem, you can make up your own mind. So, like I said, I hope you've had a chance to read this whole poem in its entirety. Anytime you're looking at a poem, you want to read the whole thing at least a few times through before you go through stanza by stanza. I have a few things in particular that I want to make sure that I talk about and annotate for while we're looking at this poem. Let's look at the first stanza. Mark but this flea, and mark in this, how little that which thou deniest me is. Now, don't be freaked out by words like thou or deniest. Thou just means you. Deniest just means deny. So you can put this into plain English pretty easily. You could even translate it in the margins if you want to. So he's saying, look at this flea, and look how in this flea, what you're denying me is just so little, just like this flea is so tiny. I want to zoom in on that word mark though, because mark actually has a couple of different meanings. Obviously, mark means some sort of spot, right? Like a marker would make a mark or a spot or some sort of sign. It can also be an indicator for travelers. When you read Shakespearean sonnets like Sonnet 116, Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds, there's a reference to a mark for travelers. The North Star, that would be an example, or a lighthouse or some sort of mark for a traveler. But it also means to observe something, to note something. Think about the term mark my words or mark this example. So here the speaker might be referencing the mark of the flea. A flea looks like a little black dot or a little black mark. But he's actually saying, more literally, he's saying, take the example of this flea or observe this flea. It's almost like he's being kind of a know-it-all here. He's being very didactic in his tone. Look at this flea. Use it as an example. But the fact that that word mark has those other meanings, right, like a spot or some sort of sign might be significant, right? A flea does sort of look like a little black mark when it lands on your hand or on your arm. So maybe both of those meanings are being used. But literally here on the surface, he means take this as an example or observe this flea. How little that which thou deniest me, how little what you deny me is. You can probably guess what the woman is denying him. If you can't guess already, you'll be able to figure that out as you continue reading the poem. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee, and in this flea our two bloods mingled be. Okay, so something you might want to know, or that you definitely want to know, is that during the Renaissance, they believed that conception took place when blood, not other fluids, were mingled. So here he's making a reference to pregnancy and conception, which seems pretty odd given what he's trying to get the implied listener to do. You could be doing this intentionally, or it could be done as the poet, kind of doing a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But here what he's saying is, this flea has mixed your blood and my blood together into this little flea baby. Ridiculous argument, right? Over the top argument. And yet this cocky speaker is going to continue with this ridiculous argument. Thou, or you, knowest that this cannot be said, a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead. Maidenhead means virginity. So here his argument gets even more provocative. He says, you know that no one could call this, a flea biting me, a flea biting you, and now our blood's being mingled, a sin or a shame or loss of virginity. And yet this flea enjoys your blood before it courts you or before it woos you. And pampered swells with one blood made of two. So he's saying, look, it's no big deal. Nobody would call this a loss of your honor, right? Therefore, you should not call what he wants her to do with him a loss of her honor. You might note the syntax there and that list, a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead. You might think about the order. Why is maidenhead or virginity the last one? And why is sin the first one? Is there some sort of significance aside from the fact that it kind of flows nicely to sin, then shame, then maidenhead or virginity? Yet this enjoys before it woo or court, and pampered swells with one blood made of two. And this, alas, is more than we would do. So alas is just an expression of frustration or exasperation. I want to focus though on that word pampered. So we all know Pampers now is the brand of diapers, but that word pampered actually comes from a word that means to treat with a lot of care, to coddle, to spoil something, right? Think of a baby that needs to be pampered and coddled and cared for. It also means to feed a lot of food. So here it's almost as if John Donne or the speaker is undermining his argument by saying this flea, like this little baby, is coddled and cared for and is gorging on your blood. And it's kind of evoking a baby, this idea of swelling or bloods made of two or something being pampered, treated with care and spoiled and coddled, does kind of evoke a baby, which again seems kind of odd, given that he's trying to convince the woman to sleep with him. And then finally, this alas is more than we would do. So clearly he's doing a lot of guilt tripping here. A lot of students find this just predatory and offensive, and I can understand why. Then we have the space between the stanzas. Oh, stay or stop, 3 lives and 1 flea spare, where we almost, nay, more than married are. So presumably between the space and the stanzas, between stanza 1 and stanza 2, the person that he is speaking to does something, right? Because he says, oh, stop or stay, 3 lives and 1 flea spare. So presumably she has gone to kill the flea, as probably any reasonable person would do, right? If this person is speaking to you. So she has gone to crush the flea, right? To kill this flea, and he tells her to stop. But here he lays it on really thick. He brings up or evokes this Christian religious imagery. 3 lives and 1 flea evokes the Trinity pretty clearly. Again, a weird tactic, right? If you're trying to convince the woman to give up her virginity, again, that had a lot of different implications in the Renaissance as opposed to today. It's kind of bizarre to bring up the Holy Trinity, and yet that's exactly what he's doing here. Where we almost nay more than married are, the idea here is that they're not just married, but their marriage has been consummated because they have this flea baby. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is. Though parents grudge in you, we are met, and cloistered in these living walls of jet. So some people believe that the reference to parents' grudge might be a reference to John Donne's own marriage and her parents, Anne Moore's parents, not being thrilled about it. I don't know about that, but I do know that that word cloistered is really compelling. So I want to zoom in on that word cloistered. So if something is cloistered, or if you are cloistered, actually a lot of you are cloistered away at the moment given COVID-19, it means to be isolated or to be sheltered. But it also has another meaning. A cloister is an area in a church. I'm sure you've all been to some sort of cathedral or church and seen a cloister. It's some sort of area of a church where nuns would often live or work. So it's interesting to use a word that means isolated, but also a word that evokes an area of a church. Again, this religious imagery. The living walls of Jet, well, Jet means black. So what are the living walls of Jet? A flea, right? That's filled with both of their blood, and that he compares to their marriage bed and their marriage temple. It's almost as if he's saying this flea is something sacred and something profane at the same time. Though use make you apt to kill me. Apt just means likely, or it's a habit. So habit makes you likely to kill me, the flea. Let not to that self-murder added be, and sacrilege, 3 sins in killing 3. So here the argument becomes incredibly over the top. He's saying, if you kill this flea, you are committing 3 sins. What are the 3 sins? Well, suicide, killing herself, homicide, killing him, and infanticide, killing the flea baby. Again, ridiculous, right? We're talking about a flea, we're talking about a pest, we're talking about a parasitic insect. And yet here he's evoking 3 big sins, big no-nos in Christian theology. So laying on a pretty thick guilt trip, maybe he's aware of how over the top and ridiculous he's being. Again, this gets to the idea that maybe this is a lawyer's brief, or this is a law student trying to impress his law school friends, not an argument that we're supposed to take seriously. Let's move on to the last stanza. Note that there are 3 stanzas in this piece, and there's all sorts of references to trinities and the Holy Trinity and the Trinity between the flea, the speaker, and the implied listener. So you see trinities all around in this piece, including with the amount of stanzas there are, 3. Let's go to the 3rd stanza. Cruel and sudden, hast thou since purpled thy nail and blood of innocence? So presumably what she's done between the stanza break is she's killed the flea. Cruelly and suddenly, according to the speaker, she's killed this flea with her nail, right? Thy means your. So let's unpack a couple specific words here. Purpled. Well, if she's killed the flea with her fingernail, why would it be purple? If you think about a black flea with a lot of blood, red blood in it, it might kind of appear purple on your finger. But also purple is a color, and I think we may have discussed purple and the ramifications of that color in this class before. Purple is a color that's commonly used to symbolize royalty, right? Kings and queens. So it could be lifting up the status of this flea, making this flea purpled, royal, as if he's wearing royal outros. But it also could allude to a different royal figure, not an actual royal figure, but a figure that's supposed to be kingly. Purpling thy nail and blood of innocence, as extreme and provocative as this might sound, is an allusion to Christ. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. This is the common interpretation of this hugely famous poem. So a reference to her nail also references nails, right? If you think about the nails that were said to have gone through Christ on the crucifix. And blood of innocence also evokes Christ. And purple, that royal or kingly color, also evokes Christ too. I know, over the top, we're talking about a flea, right? And yet that's exactly what the speaker is trying to do. Wherein could this flea guilty be, except in that drop which it sucked from thee? So what crime did this flea commit? All it did was suck some blood. Kind of sounds like a baby, right? Like what guilt could this thing have? All it did was nurse from his mother or suck your blood. Yet thou triumphs, and sayest that thou finds not thyself, nor me the weaker now. So what he's saying here is, okay, but you're feeling good about yourself, person who's listening to me, listener. You're triumphing. You're saying that you killed the flea and you don't find yourself weaker. You don't find me weaker, that it's just a flea. So here the speaker abandons his entire argument. He flips it around, but he still doesn't give up. He says, "'Tis true. Then learn how false fears be. Just so much honor when thou yields to me will waste, as this flea's death took life from me." So he basically says, you know what, you're right. This whole business about the flea being a flea baby or being innocent or as containing this holy trinity, that was all ridiculous. I admit that. But he still twists it around. Now, his argument, logically speaking, makes no sense. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. It's offensive. But it's called something that it's a word that's important to bring up in this class. It's going to come up later in the semester. It's called something called sophistry. That means wrong reason. Reasoning that sounds good at first, but actually doesn't make any sense. This is a classic example of sophistry or sophistry. It's reasoning that sounds compelling, but when you actually break it down logically, it doesn't make any sense. So here, that's what's going on. So the argument is, you're not weaker now, I'm not weaker now, you're right, the flea was just a flea, it doesn't represent our love, it doesn't represent us. But you're right, this flea is nothing, this flea is something insignificant, just like sleeping with the speaker, so he argues, will be nothing, will be insignificant, will not be a big problem. Again, the argument is ridiculous, especially when you think about the expectations on men and women during the Renaissance. But it's noteworthy that he totally abandons his former argument, building up this flea to be something incredibly important, and says, you're right, the flea is nothing, just like it'll be no big deal if you yield to me. I want to point out a couplet at the end. That's one of the terms that's on the poetry handout that you need to be aware of. The speaker rhymes me and thee. So it's a couplet, it's a rhyme, but it's more than just a rhyme. Generally, poets who are good, and John Donne is a hugely famous, or was a hugely famous poet. This is one of the most studied poems in English literature. Generally, poets know what they're doing when they're rhyming. It's not just to sound good, but it's also to connect different ideas. And isn't this what he's trying to do throughout his entire poem? Connect himself, the speaker, me, with thee, the woman that he's speaking to, presumably. He's trying to connect those two people using this metaphysical conceit of the flea. So how fitting that the poem ends with a couplet that connects me and thee through rhyme. There's so much more that you could discuss about this poem. You can find all sorts of YouTube videos of this poem being dramatized. Some of them are kind of violating, I should warn you, because it is such a provocative poem. You can find Julian Glover, a pretty famous actor, dramatizing or reading the poem out loud, and you can look at the context of the poem there. You can also do more research on the Renaissance and what was going on in terms of cultural changes and paradigm shifts. Around the same time that this poem was published, people were able to use microscopes to see the details on insects like fleas for the first time. And on the flip side, they were able to use technology to see into the cosmos, to see the planets in more detail than they had been before. So both the micro, things that are tiny that you need a microscope to see, things that are very small like a flea, and the macro, the planets, the cosmos, the stars, their conception of those things was really changing during the Renaissance, and this poem helps depict that idea of the micro being blown up into something larger than it is. And what better example than a parasitic flea being used as this huge, ridiculous, over-the-top metaphor.